Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Health Science 622 Research Methods and Program Evaluation. I'm excited to have you all back for week 4 if you're still watching these videos rather than just scrolling through the slides, which is fine. But I really want to say that research ethics is one of the most important topics to cover when we talk about research methods and program evaluation in general. It is something that we learn over time and we never stop learning, and things change a lot. And so I really highly recommend you spending a good amount of time in the readings and making sure that your city training is done. But we'll talk a little bit about some of that information now, as well as a couple of stories that I've been through and seen, because we as researchers should be at the highest ethics level we possibly can be at. So there are some major pieces of work that are the foundations of research ethics. So we have the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki, as well as the Belmont Report. So these are very some of them are very old documents, but the first one was really about mandated voluntary consent for experimental studies of humans. So we had to make sure that people consented and were not coerced. And the Declaration of Helsinki was written by the World Medical Association to provide guidelines for physicians conducting clinical trials, but that's expanded to all researchers. And then the Belmont Report was really a huge piece of the puzzle, and it defined key research principles and is that foundational document for the current federal policies for protecting human subjects in research, so the participants that we include. So there are 3 core principles when we think of research ethics. So respect is for persons is a broad concept that emphasizes them being volunteers and they have autonomy over what they do. And so in other words, what steps have been taken to protect individual rights or the community's values? Has the risk of coercion in recruitment been considered and minimized? Is there privacy and confidentiality? And what about appropriate community-based research methods? Is there a community-based representative on your project? So a lot of things go into respect, some things required, some things extra, but definitely something to keep in mind. So the second one is really about, that what you do benefits who you're studying, that it should do good, and it really shouldn't do any harm. So how will individuals benefit from participating in your study? And sometimes there isn't that direct benefit, and that doesn't mean a study can't be done. So if someone participates in a survey but there's no incentive, something like that, you might say, well, what benefit is there? Sometimes when we think about benefit, and maybe it's kind of shortcoming for the participants, but it's just a contribution in knowledge with benefits to later populations. So the larger group as a whole, rather than, oh, this person is getting some sort of treatment. What we find out from this work could move forward policy, procedures, practice, and really move that literature forward. And then we have distributive justice, and it's really about ensuring that the benefits and burdens of research are equitable. So what are the long-term benefits of your research? Will they gain knowledge about their health status? So participants in your study. What about will results be shared with them after the study is completed? That's definitely important. And in regards to, say, a community, will the research have an ongoing relationship with the community, or is it like a one and done type of thing? That's not distributive justice. And when the grant funding runs out, does everything stop? Are those resources gone? So these are questions that you definitely want to think when we think about these three core principles. And this is from your book. So again, it's thinking about individual participants and community participants. I won't go through this because you have it in your notes as well as the book, but these are definitely things to really digest and keep in mind when designing a study with human subjects. So in addition to these three core principles, we also have some central consideration when we think about research ethics. And the first one is contribution. Why is the project important? Like what you're proposing, why is it important? And how will individuals or the communities benefit from the study? And we don't ask, and I really want to make this very clear, we don't ask how will the researchers benefit from this study? Because yes, a lot of the time we as researchers benefit in some ways, tenure, getting research dollars, things like that. But it's really, really important that when we do human subjects research, we're thinking about the benefit of the communities and the people that we're studying and we're serving, not ourselves. So contribution to the greater good in, so many words. So there's another consideration, the second one consideration in research ethics is compensation. This one's a weird one when you talk about grant funding, but that's a whole different story. But will individuals or communities that participate in your study be offered any form of, compensation for their time? But a lot of the time, it's no, if we don't have a lot of funding. But if there is, what is actually being offered as that incentive or compensation? Is it appropriate? Is the offer so high that it could be coercive, or so low that the study could be exploitive? So are you not giving enough? Are you giving too much? A really good example of this is I used to work with and he was a professor of mine, Dr. Steve Meshnick at UNC Chapel Hill, and he did a lot of work in malaria in sub-Saharan Africa. And it was important work, but these people, the IRB and the study researchers, when they had participants, they really only included a bar of soap as compensation. And that's because anything more would be coercive, and and anything less would be exploitive. So it doesn't seem like a lot to you maybe, but in that case, it was what they could provide. And IRB usually can help determine this, or previous work. And, again, I could talk about this for a long time. I work with incarcerated populations who people think they should get less, but really I think they should get similar. But it is important because when we think of compensation, we really want to think about, are the risks of participation minimal? And if it's not, that's important, and how we actually compensate someone. We also think about how will study-related injuries be handled. So it happens sometimes with clinical trials or, any type of study. And are those risks and benefits balanced? The third central consideration, I think this was 3, is consent. So this was definitely a thing that was brought up at the beginning of this lecture. But really, how are you going to inform your participants about the study, and how will you document that information? That is all of it, how they are informed, how they get consented, Sometimes it's important to think, will a test of comprehension of the informed consent statement be required? And this has implications who is in your study. Are you talking about people with disabilities, maybe children? So really think about that. And it's not always applicable, but if it is, how will consent be acquired for children and other potentially vulnerable populations? And that might include that test for comprehension. And and this happens a lot in tribal research, but it happens for other types of research as well. Will community meetings be held prior to beginning the study? Sometimes, like I said, this is required. Work on Navajo Nation requires letters of support or, people on, communities on board before you actually can start consenting people or doing your study at all. The next consideration, central consideration in research, is confidentiality. This is something, that is contentious in our communities as a whole. But for research, it's really important that you know how the privacy and confidentiality of participants and their personal information is maintained, where it's stored, and that you can ensure that their information is private. And there is a website here, it's in your notes on in BBLearn, but NAU has guidance on how to do that. Another consideration in research ethics, this is one of my favorite and one of my, I think one of the most important, is the community. So community is so important when we consider our research. So will the selection process be fair? So is the source population appropriate for the goals of the research study? So you want to make sure that who you're sampling from is the right community. Is it fair? Will the sample size be adequate? And are potentially vulnerable individuals and communities adequately protected? So that actually falls under some of those other considerations. Has the protocol been adapted to address the cultural expectations of your population? We can't just drop different things, in different groups to say, okay, this is good. And if applicable, has the community agreed to participate in the project? So when I conduct research in our correctional facilities, I have to make sure everyone who wants to participate in the study has equal opportunity to do so. Sometimes we even have to include more people than we initially intended for to be fair, because again, you're in a situation that you want to make sure everyone has that opportunity to participate if they want to. Another consideration is conflicts of interest, and you can see a pattern here, lots of C's. So who is contributing to the project's finances? So who is funding the study? What about who is working on the logistics of the study? Might potential conflicts of interest inhibit the ability of a researcher to conduct ethical or unbiased work? You have to think a lot about this. Like a really good example, and this happens a lot, is say Coca-Cola funding research on sugar. And we've seen this where there's a lot of sugar in Coca-Cola or Pepsi or something like that. And if they're funding the research, that's a conflict of interest, because those findings on how bad sugar is for you actually has an impact on, the sales of their product. And so that's something you have to disclose. And when we talk about that, if you have a potential conflict of interest that you have to report, you have to disclose that information. Another consideration in research ethics is committees. So in research, which research ethic committee or committees need to review the project? if you're doing human subjects research, the institutional review board at your institution needs to do that. But also when we think about committees, you also want to think about what community organizations have been consulted about your proposed project. So it's not just those necessarily legal committees for human subjects research, but also those communities. So those were our considerations, central considerations in research ethics. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these more in depth. So incentives and coercion falls under a couple of them. And we really want to thank participants. And that desire to thank participants has to be balanced with the need for participation in any research project to be voluntary. So we don't want to coerce people to be part of our project by giving them, too much money or too much stuff. And that seems kind of weird, I know, but we don't want someone to be offered $1,000 for, doing something they might be uncomfortable with, but because the money is so good, they would do it anyway. We have to be transparent about what participants will and won't gain from participation in the research study. So we can't say, you're going to get X, Y, and Z when X, Y, and Z doesn't exist. Throughout this whole process, when we do research with human subjects and recruitment, we have to be very transparent. Remember that word. Transparency is best, because we don't want any sort of coercion. To help with that, we really have to be very thoughtful about our informed consent statements, and there's a couple of slides on this. So we want to provide essential information about research projects to potential research participants so that they can make a thoughtful decision whether or not to enroll in your study for themselves. And it has to use clear, simple language that the reader understands. So when we write these consent statements, we have to think about reading level of our participants, use of jargon, and other things. And it might actually be a really good idea to have a community member or someone who, falls into the category of the people you're recruiting to read it over before distributing. So I have a great friend and consultant for me who has been incarcerated and reads over all of my work before I distribute it. And it's really helpful because I can't put myself in their shoes. And if possible, always walk through the consent statement with the participants and give them the opportunity to ask questions and get clarification. So it's really important to think about what's in your consent statements. So you have to define your research and really explicitly say what the aims or your purpose is. You want a description of who can't participate in your study and why, and description of the study procedures, what they're actually asked to do, if they participate, is expected. And it's expected to be thoughtful and truthful. Transparency, remember? And we really want to make sure that benefits are described to everyone, to whether it's them as a participant or society as a whole, but that includes compensation. And sometimes there's just a statement that there will be no direct benefits, but they need to know that so they can make that informed decision. You also want to state risks. So what could possibly make them uncomfortable? Will it cost anything? Or are there any unforeseeable risks? And how will injuries be handled? But description of the steps that will be taken to maintain a participant's confidentiality is really important so that risk is minimal. So you want to say that, hey, we're protecting your information, especially for those projects that might have some, very personal questions. Like, for example, the adverse childhood experience questionnaire can be uncomfortable for people. You want to ensure that their results are safe, or I'm sorry, their, answers are safe. You always have to say it's voluntary and they can withdraw at any time from the study with no penalty. And you have to describe how they can do that. And you want to make sure that they have an ability to contact you after they leave. And it depends on what it is. Like I know I use incarcerated populations a lot, but I work with them a lot, and it has to be appropriate. My phone number is always free to call from the detention facility. That is an agreement I've made with a detention facility. If they have any questions, they don't have to pay to get a hold of me. And definitely somewhere where they can sign. There's a little bit of a caveat there. You always want to get consent. Sometimes you can do a waiver of consent, which means like they don't have to sign if they do something, but that's a little bit more complicated. For this informed consent process, it really is intended to be a process. I mean, it's not just this like piece of paper here, read this, sign, let's move on. It's about having them understand what your research is for, why you're doing it, what they're doing, what they're going to get out of it. And the lines of communication really should remain open even after you've collected the data with your participants so they can understand what's going on. And for most research studies, you really hope to have a printed copy of the informed consent signed by each participant. And again, like I said, in a number of limited observational studies, that full process of acquiring and documenting individual consent may not be required. But again, that's really determined by the institutional review board and whether or not they can approve that. And it has to do with your population, your study type, and what you're studying. So there are processes, but again, it's case-by-case basis. So when we think about informed consent, something that a lot of participants want to make sure of is that their data is safe with you. And it's really about the protection of that personal information that they're divulging and giving to a stranger in a lot of cases. And we want to assure that those individuals get to choose what information they reveal about themselves, and what that is can be safe. Because when we think about some of the work that we do, there's a lot of sensitive issues, and they might not feel comfortable if you weren't assuring privacy. So researchers asking questions about sensitive issues really should decide ahead of time on how to handle those disclosures. Something like participating in illegal activities. The research team can apply for a certificate of confidentiality that protects the identity of participants from being subject to court orders and other legal demands for information. If you don't want to apply for that certificate of confidentiality, go back to that first step and really decide how to handle that. So how do you want to ask your questions? Do you want to ask those questions? Is it pertinent to your research question? When we do work with incarcerated populations while they're incarcerated, we ask questions very thoughtfully and carefully to make sure that we're not asking them if they're doing illegal activities while incarcerated, because that's not pertinent to our research questions, and it helps protect them, from exactly this. This is something that's really, really important, our cultural considerations. A protocol, a consent form, the actual research study really needs to be appropriate to the culture or cultures of the expected study participants. And through some of your readings, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, didn't take that into consideration. And it may be really helpful to have a local advisory board to facilitate that communication between the researchers and community. Those local advisory boards usually are made up of community members. And there is a field of research that focuses on cultural adaptation of research. So it is appropriate for the communities you're interested in helping. And there are a lot of experts here at NAU who do that kind of work. And it's, it's wonderful. When we do human subjects research, we have defined vulnerable populations by law. Children and some adults with cognitive impairments may not be considered competent to make informed decisions. And whenever possible, in addition to having a legal representative's consent, potential participants should assent to their own participation. So when I say assent, it means that, yeah, they can't give informed consent because they're either not old enough or may not have the ability, but they shouldn't be doing this against their will if they don't want to. So even if a parent says, yeah, sure, that's fine, but a child feels uncomfortable, that's not always a great idea to move forward with research. To do all of this work, research ethic committees usually require everyone who will be in direct contact with research participants or even just their data to complete formal research training. So the city training or CITI training, which you have to do for this week, is required at NAU and actually at most universities. It might be all universities, I'm not sure. There's also RCR, or Responsible Conduct of Research training programs that spell out expectations and procedures for disclosing those conflicts of interest. You can avoid misconduct, and really about professionalism among researchers. So those aren't necessarily always required, but very good options if you're going to do human subjects research. And so here at NAU, our Human Subjects Research Protection Program, so our IRB, protects human subjects. In the future, if it's your graduate project, your dissertation, your product that you're doing for this class, you may be recruiting participants or using what's called PII, personally identifiable information, that requires a review from our institutional review board. This is a serious conversation to have with your mentor, with me, rather than, you want it to happen now rather than later. If you're hopping on to someone else's projects, you also might need to be added to an existing IRB. So keep these in mind. And I want to say, if you're working with Navajo Nation, they have their own IRB, and you'll have to go through them as well. And these ethics committees have three really main goals. And they protect human subjects who will participate in research. They protect researchers by preventing them from engaging in activities that could cause harm, and legally protect the researcher's institution from the liability that could occur as a result of research activities. And I want to note, in those three statements, they are not required to protect researchers from harm. So their main concern is the study participants. And again, the major functions, they review new and revised research protocols, and they approve or disapprove them. They want to make sure informed consent is documented if it's required. And they, again, keep an eye on you throughout your research. So if it's a long-term research project, they do continuing reviews to make sure everything is going well. And there are links in your slides how to do that here at NAU. And they're really, NAU's website is fantastic. So that's the end of kind of the ethics lecture, but I do want to take a minute to think about the readings you had this week. So these are really, really important topics and mistakes that were made. And I put them in air quotes when in reality, it was just, they're not good. So really think about, what did Arizona State University's researchers do that was unethical? And when we think about that, they used their um, samples for things that these people, that the Havasupai tribe did not agree to. And there are a lot of things that ASU researchers could have done to make sure their work was ethical. So keep that in mind and think about how you would do that, because this is a really important topic that should be discussed. And again, this is not the only one that's taught. You might hear of the Tuskegee syphilis studies. I think there was some prison research done here in the United States, and none of it would fly today. And should have never been able to fly. But I really want you to take some time this week to really think about the work you're doing and make sure that you're moving forward in the correct way. So again, thank you. I hope you all have a wonderful week. Really learned a little bit about research ethics. And if you have any questions or need some help with navigating this, please let me know. I'd be happy to help.